Thanks so much for having me. And I was just saying to James before this, it's crazy, but maybe expected, how well everything that's been spoken about during the AGM and since maps onto what I am going to talk about. But that is partly because I based this talk on the description of Central London Humanists today, which is a social club, a volunteer group and an educational network for humanists and allies in and around London. So that is very much what this is all based around. And hopefully you'll leave with a sense that you are very much part of a centuries-long tradition of doing that very thing in London and indeed around the world, as we've heard so much. And again, the Humanist Heritage project itself has been going since 2019. The website launched in 2021, and that was to mark the 125th anniversary of Humanists UK, which was founded in 1896 as the Union of Ethical Societies. And I'll talk a little bit, but not too much, about what that means, because people might have heard me talk before, and I've talked quite a lot now about the Union of Ethical Societies, so you might be sick of it. If it's completely new to you, then by all means ask about it after or at the end. But what we're doing now is this Heritage Lottery funded project called Doers, Dreamers, Placemakers. And one of the things that we are doing as part of that, and you can see this beautiful image of Conway Hall behind me, is creating a virtual tour of Conway Hall, which will be usable largely for school groups, so that they can virtually visit a place of humanist significance in the way that they might visit physically a place of worship. But also to really emphasise the fact that the history of humanism is a history of people. It's not just a history of ideas, of books, of scientific discoveries, although it is those things as well. It's very, very much a history of people, of community, of gathering and of coming together based around shared values to usually, or often I should say, make significant changes in the world, which is what, as I say, we heard so much during the AGM and on the topic really of that kind of international outlook of humanism, which is very much present and has always been in the London context. I've got here a quote which comes from the hopes of the group that built and opened Conway Hall in 1929. Conway Hall itself isn't super old. It was opened, as I say, in 1929, but it is one of only two surviving buildings today in the UK that was built by and for the non-religious, the other being Leicester Secular Hall, which is much older, and that dates from the 1880s. But nevertheless, they both fulfilled a very important function, which was to have a dedicated place for people to come together. And importantly, and it comes out in this quote, people to come together who might be holding opinions that not everybody agrees with, that might go against the general trend of things. Now, as again has been said, it's easier than it was historically and certainly in many other countries today to hold these views. But at the time, certainly when Leicester Secular Hall was opened in the late 19th century and into the 1920s and beyond, they weren't necessarily popular ideas, and they were he wanted to find people and to collaborate with them who held them. The slightly longer version of this quote which is from Edgar Frank Errington, who was a member of the South Place Ethical Society, which is the group that built Conway Hall, is that one of the most important tasks for the future will be in getting new members and making Conway Hall known. And the great advantage of continually meeting and mixing with folk with similar ideas and sympathies will soon be realised. Quite apart from the expressed objects of our society, the bond of fellowship is of far-reaching importance, especially to the type of person we are likely to attract, holding, as we do, views that are not generally accepted by the majority of people. Personally, I do not now feel the want of any exhortation, but I do feel the need of fellowship with people who are more or less in sympathy with my views, at least on one important side of life. To me, fellowship is life, and the lack of fellowship is boredom. Slight riff off William Morris there. So as part of this project this year, as well as doing the Creating a Virtual Tour, we've got volunteers working on research using materials that we've got at Conway Hall, held at the Bishopsgate Institute as well. This is a group of them there in August of last year. That draws on a much longer volunteering programme that's been happening really for the duration of the Humanist Heritage Project. And if anyone is interested in doing any research or being involved in any other way, then obviously do let me know. Again, always after volunteers. One of the other things that I would like to mention too, because some of these things will be becoming more evident and being made more available over the course of this year, is that we're doing scanning and digitisation of some of the materials that we have at the Bishopsgate, which is a huge amount, so it's by no means everything, but with two main focuses. One is some of the early minute books of some of the ethical societies that comprised the Union of Ethical Societies, so the forerunners of humanist groups today. This one at the top is from the West London Ethical Society, which was formed in 1892, and this is a representative page, some of the minutes from their meetings, and then their very attractive looking sign-up sheet. And then we've also got this first issue of the Gay Humanist Group newsletter. The Gay Humanist Group were formed in 1979, partly as a response to the Mary Whitehouse prosecution of gay news for blasphemy, when she was ultimately successful, first successful blasphemy prosecution in 50 years when she took against gay news. She blamed an intellectual gay humanist lobby for the backlash that she received from the public. And a group of gay humanists thought, that doesn't exist, but it sounds great. And so, thanks Mary Whitehouse, she inadvertently, and I'm sure much to her chagrin, gave us the Gay Humanist Group, who became LGBT Humanists today. There's an amazing run of those newsletters at the Bishopsgate, which start in 1979 and go right the way through, covering a huge amount of stuff, including lots of campaigning they're involved in. Also, again, they're socialising, they're putting on plays, their meetings, discussions, debates, and again, a running theme, their involvement with international groups like the Gay Atheist League of America, and also various European groups as well, including holidays and things, which again is a feature of the wider humanist movement. So to start out, I just want to mention, as I say, fairly briefly, a bit of context for the ethical societies. The first ethical society in the UK was in London. It was the London Ethical Society. It was very influenced by, or in fact, kind of directly emerged out of the ethical culture movement in the US, which had been started by Felix Adler, son of a rabbi, in New York, in 1876, who wanted a society which could bring people together on the basis of wanting to live a good life, but without the need to agree on supernatural ideas or theological ideas. And this, once started, really caught on. So the first ethical society formed in 1886, and at the kind of high point, there were over 70 different societies around the UK. And I do mean around the UK, so there's 30 just in London, but there were also ones in Belfast, Scotland, in the rest of Ireland, in Wales, all around the country, and of vastly different characters as well, which is similar, I think, to humanist groups today, which is that depending on where they are and who was kind of initiating and populating them, they had very different characters. So some of them, for example, were very closely tied to the Labour movement, and almost functioned as kind of like branches of the Labour Party in certain places. Others were more, I don't want to say talking shops, but they were more populated by philosophers and thinkers who wanted largely to discuss philosophical ideas, which was very much a part of this. But I wanted to create this map to show that there was this real kind of explosion of interest in this idea of ethics without religion, basically. So London Ethical Society was the first. 4 London societies came together in 1896 to form the Union, which is what ultimately became, through various changes of name, Humanists UK today. There were also things like the Croydon Labour Church, so that was part of the Labour Church movement, which was essentially wanting to bring the promised land of heaven to bear in this life. And again, that is testament to the very close relationship with the Labour movement that has always been there as well. There was the Hampstead Ethical Institute, founded in 1900, and directly the ancestor of the Hampstead Humanist group, so a continuous decades-long existence, until sadly I think they stopped in the 2000s, but a very, very long life. And then there was other slightly different or interesting groups, like the Forest Group, who met in Epping Forest, were very focused on nature rambles, on learning from nature, on putting on plays in the forest as well, and generally celebrating kind of connection between human beings and nature and what we can learn from it. Early environmentalists, really. And then there was a Central London Ethical Society, your direct ancestors. There was a women's group, which started in 1915, and their first kind of public act actually was to post a message from the women's group of the ethical movement to call for international peace and to talk about the role that they felt women in particular had in bringing that about. There was a young people's group as well that started in 1923, and as I say, all over London and indeed the UK, and indeed the world, I should say. So, just very quickly, the characteristics of some of these societies. Socialising has always been a part of it. I can't resist putting the Friday Club up, partly because their design is so satisfying to me, and that all of their things are always really nicely coloured, but they were associated with the West London Ethical Society. This is from the 20s. You can get a bit of a sense, especially with this massive screen, of what they were doing. So you can see some of the subjects of the talks that they had, some of the fun-sounding events, so dramatic evening. Rambles, they loved a ramble. And it sounds, to be honest, like with the programme of walks that you have here, that you are very much inheriting that tradition, or continuing, I should say. I don't know how much folk dancing you do, but there's always room for that as well. Debates, concerts, lectures, it was all going on. And these ethical societies were very much places for celebrating shared values, but also celebrating things like culture. You see in the membership list that we do have quite a lot of artists, for example, and creatives and people we know were writing and creating about art. Also loads of teachers. There has always been so many teachers in the humanist movement right from the beginning, which is really interesting, I think. And people of all kinds. So it was very much a place that you get the sense that people were sometimes being drawn to or into because of shared interests they might have with people who are already members, but also places that really fostered these shared interests in things like culture, as I say, but also in areas of activism, which I'll mention as well. That idea of change-making, of being a place that encouraged volunteering, that encouraged activism, that encouraged reform. These are just a couple of examples, and there could be so many, and it was partly what I had to hand at the time. But you've got an example of a motion on women's suffrage put forward by the Council of the Ethical Union, which was what the Union of Ethical Societies became, and the precursor to the British Humanist Association. As I say, lots of changes in names, but fundamentally Humanists UK. So this is in the 20s, and they're saying basically, we said there's an intention to give women the vote on the same grounds as men, so let's do it, let's push for that to really happen. This is something that is a particular kind of passion or interest of mine within the movement, is this very, very strong tie between women's suffrage and the humanist movement. And I think it makes a lot of sense. in many ways, and I'll mention that again in a minute, but there was definitely that strong support within the movement itself, and also by members within the groups for particularly things like women's suffrage and generally democracy, better representation, all of that. I've also included some examples of some of the affiliations that the Ethical Union had in the 60s. These are representative of much longer standing affiliations, so they were always very closely linked with the League of Nations and the UN by their various names, Liberty, or the National Council for Civil Liberties, which was in fact founded by Humanists, just so you know, and League Against Cruel Sports, Council for the Development of General Education, and of course the International Humanist and Ethical Union. It should be noted that that had a precursor to in the International Ethical Union, which was founded in 1896 in the same year as the Union of Ethical Societies. So right from the beginning, there has been an international dimension, helped by the fact that lots of the early founders of the individual ethical societies were themselves international. And finally, and I mentioned it, this idea, so for Central London Humanists today, this idea of an educational network or being an educational network, but that concept of learning and educating has always existed right from the beginning in various ways. So that included things like the Ethical Sunday School, which you can see represented here. This is the East London example, but there were similar things, similar kind of secular Sunday schools, groups for children, various efforts to help young people in the world across lots of the different societies. Very strong focus on secular and moral education, again, right from the beginning. So the Moral Education League, which sought non-theological moral instruction in schools rather than Bible education, was again founded very early on in the life of the Union of Ethical Societies in 1897. So again, a long precedent for working for more representative, more inclusive education in schools for young people. Part of the reason I put this meeting or lecture list in here is just because as for subjects, Christ, women's share in social progress, happiness and death, it's just a powerful collection. And they did hold outdoor meetings in Victoria Park, so that was something that, again, this is the East London example, but was very much a part of things. Okay, actually, before I move on. So, like I say, I don't want to dwell for ages on the kind of generalities of the ethical movement, except to say that there was very clearly a strong draw to this idea of separating ethics and the idea of morality and being good, living a good life, from religion and theological ideas. And that, I think, is what drew lots of people to the movement in general, because with the kind of shake-up of things like theories of evolution and scientific discoveries and increased understanding that happened in the 19th century, where people had been kind of questioning or unloosed from their religious faiths, they were seeking something else. But also, I think it tells us a lot about why it was very popular with women right from the beginning. So somebody like Zona Valance, who I talk about a lot, who's actually on here, she was the honorary secretary of the East London Ethical Society. She was also the first honorary secretary of the Union of Ethical Societies and of the International Ethical Union and of the Moral Instruction League. She was a suffragist, a writer on women's rights, a generally all-round amazing person. But what she was particularly drawn to and what she wrote about was the power of this idea of us being finite beings, of us having a single life, and what that meant for us in this world, particularly for women. Her idea was that if we're suddenly, or perhaps finally, free of biblical ideas of hierarchy when it comes to the sexes in particular, then that means we can remake the world to reflect our values, to reflect what we want. and that was incredibly appealing, and I think had been also to earlier generations of free-thinking women, of whom there were lots as well. It is my area of obsession, so we can talk about that later, of course. And the idea of the ethical societies was very much separating the idea of what was good from what was just traditional, or seen to be good, or accepted as good. So to really question and to really come up with those things for themselves. But that wasn't just about morals in a very abstract sense. It was a really active interest in social reform, especially in areas that were influenced by religion. So reproductive rights, marriage and divorce, blasphemy, obscenity, and, as I mentioned, education. And that is why I used to often call the first kind of talks I used to give when I started on the project well-being and well-doing, because that was a phrase that they used in the London Ethical Societies to describe what they stood for. So it was well-being within a community and within a community of like-minded people, but also well-doing, how you put those ethics into action. Which is why what I'm going to do is narrow down or focus in on a few kind of exemplary figures who aren't necessarily super well known. I've talked about a couple of them before and you might have heard me, but I've deliberately chosen some who hopefully you won't have heard me talk about. But these are also people for whom being part of the humanist movement seems to have been particularly important in their life and work. So as people who were very much inheritors of what, again, came out of the AGM so strongly, which is the value of being a part of these groups, being a part of the wider movement to these people in what they did and how they lived their life. I have talked about May Seton Tiedemann before, you might have heard me. Again, another amazing woman, American-born. She came to England when she was a teenager, and she spent decades of her life fighting for reform of the divorce laws. She herself had two very happy marriages, two very long and happy marriages, which ended only with the deaths of her husbands. So both of her marriages lasted nearly 30 years. So she wasn't motivated to champion easier divorce because she wanted one. It was because she very much felt that the existing laws were discriminatory, unfair, and certainly detrimental to women's rights. At the time she started campaigning, it was very difficult to get a divorce. It was expensive, but also the only way that you could get one was if you could prove adultery. So you could have a separation on other accounts, but adultery was the grounds for divorce. So what she was fighting for was very much an opening up of this. She spoke to hundreds of women, and she was secretary of the Divorce Law Reform Union, which had much more famous figureheads, including Arthur Conan Doyle, who got much more kind of attention than she did. What's interesting with May Seton Tiedemann is that this was, that her humanism, because she was very actively involved in the Union of Ethical Societies, involved in the women's group, took organisational roles on the council and in various other ways. This was mentioned in her Dictionary of National Biography entry. So Cordelia Moyes, who wrote that, said she was not motivated by personal experience of an unhappy marriage, as I've said, but rather by her belief that immorality, injustice and unnecessary human suffering were not to be tolerated. A member of the Ethical Union, her secular humanism found its fullest expression in the divorce reform movement, not least because the primary ideology of opponents of reform was Christianity. For her, the extension of matrimonial jurisdiction was as important as the extension of the divorce grounds themselves. In 1937, she was, or they were, a collective group. I won't give all the credit to her. The law was changed. So in 1937, the Matrimonial Causes Act was passed. This was a private member's bill put forward by A.P. Herbert. And it extended the grounds for divorce to include desertion for over 3 years, cruelty, and incurable insanity. Yeah, there were more changes to come. She wasn't completely satisfied with that, needless to say. But it's again notable that one of her fellow workers for this, and a fellow worker in the Ethical Union as well, Alexander Howell Smith, wrote to the Times to correct the record because she'd been largely left out of reporting of it. And you can see her here in Hyde Park fighting her corner. He wrote to the Times that all sympathisers with divorce law reform are deeply grateful to Mr. A.P. Herbert for his gallant and strenuous advocacy of the bill that has now been carried by both houses. The press has paid him his due tribute. The pleasure, however, he will feel at this recognition of his efforts will be strongly qualified, as all the members of the Executive Committee of the Divorce Law Reform Union are well aware, by the strange silence of so many newspapers on the long-sustained work of Mrs. Seton Tiedemann, the Union's honorary secretary, without whom Mr. Herbert's bill might very well have miscarried. For 25 years, in season and out of season, by lectures and debates in many places, nearly every Sunday she's advocated her cause in Hyde Park. By correspondence in the press and by innumerable interviews, Mrs. Seton Tiedemann has worked for divorce law reform, sparing neither her health nor her purse. And it's notable as well, I found earlier a letter that was in the record of the South Place Ethical Society, so Conway Hall, where they were, shortly after the passage of this law, writing a letter of sympathy to May Seton Tiedemann, who clearly had some kind of breakdown in health fairly swiftly after this. So she clearly, quite literally, did kind of drive herself into the ground in order to achieve this really major reform that paved the way for later further liberalising of the laws. Which leads me on to another figure called Gustav Spiller, and another international figure. So Spiller himself was born in Hungary, in Budapest. He left school before he was 12 and apprenticed to a printer, working 65 hours a week, we're told. He came to London in about 1885 and worked as a compositor and for a number of years for the Bank of England as well. And then he joined the Ethical Union. He started lecturing for the Ethical Union and he continually educated himself, so attended evening classes, attended further education classes. What's particularly interesting, I think, about Gustav Spiller is that he very much channeled his own, I think, internationalism into this wider interest of the Union of Ethical Societies in international cooperation and international understanding as well. He actually worked also for the League of Nations, but he organised the first International Moral Education Congress, which brought people from all over the world to London to discuss moral education as opposed to religious instruction, and the first Universal Races Congress, which was a really fascinating and sadly the last. They hoped it would be the one of many, but the First World War intervened. However, it was a congress which was designed to bring people from all over the world, again, together to discuss, in the light of science, relations between the races and to try and improve understanding between countries and between races too. It was essentially the world's first anti-racist congress, really. Something similar didn't happen or wasn't organised by the UN for decades. He also, again, I was banking on this being so small that you wouldn't possibly try and read it. Unfortunately, it's enormous, so you can read it if you want. But this is basically just to say that Gustav Spiller did not stop with the first Universal Races Congress. He wanted this to be the slightly long-winded, it has to be said, world conferences for promoting concord between all divisions of mankind. And he had lots of very prominent supporters of this, including the very famous African-American intellectual activist thinker freethinker, W.E.B. Du Bois, who was also, of course, very, very significant in the early civil rights movement. Again, his kind of obituaries and his memories, where they existed, of Gustav Spiller, very much noted the significance of the Union of Ethical Societies in allowing him to pursue his interests, both in learning, in the sociology of religion, because he was a sociologist as well, and in, of course, this international understanding and bringing people from different countries together. His obituary in the Sociological Review in 1940 said, "Those who knew him personally will not readily forget the depth of his convictions, his personal modesty, his unhesitating courage in maintaining his views, his personal charm, and his gentle spirit. He married in 1903. His wife's unfailing support contributed much to his achievement." I love this, because yes, it did. Nina Spiller, not to be forgotten, also French-born, absolutely fascinating, again, activist for her whole life, both, again, in international cooperation, in her case in the international suffrage movement. She was very, very active in the International Alliance of Women, including as its treasurer for 10 years, and as a kind of travelling spokesperson for it, going all around the world and encouraging more people to join this international league of women, essentially working for the improvement of women's rights in countries across the world. She also was active from the beginning of the 20th century, so she was a member from 1901, before her marriage to Gustav Spiller. Whether that's where they met, I don't know, but it's very possible. But she was already a member by 1901 of, again, the West London Ethical Society. And she's pictured in photos of the Ethical Union gatherings into the 1960s. So that's her just on the right there, next to another great humanist, Rose Bush, one of the founders of the Humanist Housing Association. And above, some of the maybe more famous names from the humanist movement, so Harold Blackham on the bottom left there, and Hector Horton on the bottom right. But you can see these two powerhouses of women in the middle there, including Nina Spiller, who really did have, again, as this obituary from, in this case, the Humanist mentions, a lucid mind with rare charm, and that she'd been a part of the humanist movement for over half a century. So it was very much intertwined with her wider life, her social life certainly, and also her activism. And it's interesting to note that in 1966, the headquarters of the International Alliance of Women became 13 Prince of Wales Terrace, which was the office of the BHA, or Humanist UK as it was by that point. And I don't think that would have been a coincidence. I strongly suspect that Nina Spiller would have been the engineer of that collaboration, as you might expect. Briefly introduce another power couple of the movement. This gave me the idea, actually, for a little series come Valentine's Day of humanist power couples, because there have been quite a lot. And William Sanders, a Labour politician, and his wife Beatrice are very much an example of this. William Sanders was another one, left school very young, worked first as a farmer's boy and then a clerk from the age of 11. Again, very much self-educated through various evening classes and working men's colleges. Very early on involved in socialism, so he joined the Social Democratic Federation in the late 1880s, the Fabian Society, which he was very involved in. And he was also, again, involved in the League of Nations, deputy chief of the administrative section in the 1920s. He, too, was very involved in the ethical movement. He was a lecturer for the Union of Ethical Societies and wrote various political pamphlets for them as well as giving talks, both about the ethical movement itself and about politics and kind of the reorganisation of society. He's described by Gustav Spiller, who also wrote a history of the movement up until the 30s, of what he called a quite noticeably big group of largely whole-time workers. So they were volunteers, does this sound familiar to anyone? But they gave a lot of their time to the movement. Gustav Spiller puts it in fairly, it has to be said, religious language. He talks about proclaiming the ethical gospel here, there and everywhere in the land, which is what they were doing. But he notes that without them, ethical groups would have found it difficult to start and even more difficult to continue. So these were the people who were organising, lecturing, bringing people in as part of it. His wife, I love this photo so much because it's so high quality and you rarely get that, was a suffragette. She was very involved in the Women's Social and Political Union, famous of course for the Pankhursts. But the Pankhursts, Emmeline in particular, ended up becoming a little bit dictatorial. Lots of people broke away from the WSPU and joined the Women's Freedom League, including lots of humanists or early freethinkers. But she was treasurer of the WSPU and apparently ruled that with an iron fist. If people didn't properly account for themselves, then they had to pay for themselves. So there was no getting past Beatrice. What I think is also very interesting about these two is that they married in what was described in the newspapers as an ethical wedding, or an ethical marriage. And this was essentially an early humanist ceremony. It was reported in the press quite widely and described as something of a curiosity in the way of weddings, and essentially follows a very similar pattern to humanist weddings today. They'd already been married in the register office, and they then had an ethical ceremony in Battersea Town Hall in their case. It was led by Stanton Coit, who was one of the leading figures of the ethical societies. And it said that he gave a homily on the duties of the parties to one another and their combined duty to the community of which they formed a part. So again, a very interesting early example of essentially a humanist marriage, a humanist ceremony. Last but not least, I want to mention somebody who we've got certainly less photographic evidence for, but another, I guess, intriguing figure within the ethical movement, who was listed for years and years and years as a life member. And he was Christian Abraham Acker, born in Ghana and educated partly at the London School of Economics, so the LSE. Partly he caught my eye because it's not a name that you see very often, especially in the history, it has to be said, of the humanist movement. But what is especially interesting, I think, about C.A. Acker is that his writings, he was a geography teacher, he was also an educationist, and again another sociologist. And he wrote about traditional African philosophy. So as I say, he was born in Ghana. He held various educational positions, including as principal of a couple of different colleges on the Cape Coast, sorry. And he was also a life member of the Royal Institute of Philosophy, of the British Sociological Association, and of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences. All of those things are mentioned in his Who Was Who, or his dictionary of his entry in the Dictionary of African Biography. But his life membership of the Ethical Union isn't. But I think it's relevant that he chose to become a life member of the Ethical Union, not least when you know that in his book on Akan ethics, so about the ethical values of a particular part of Ghana, he discussed where those moral codes came from aside from religion. It was often assumed that and often still is assumed, that lots of traditional and moral ideas in Africa and African countries more broadly are very much the product of religion and Christian teachings in particular. What he argued was that actually human interconnectedness, the functioning of communities, our responsibilities to other people are at least as much, but probably more responsible for our concepts of right and wrong and how we conduct ourselves in the world than these religious ideas were. And this is something that is still discussed in kind of philosophical understandings and philosophical writings about traditional African religion and spirituality today. And again, I've been to events organised by Central London Humanists and the Association of Black Humanists where these are the exact things that are discussed now. Where do these things come from, and where is there evidence of humanist ideas in that global context? And I think it's interesting that ACCA was doing that when it was also very much a part of what the Ethical Union was doing, which was to extract the one from the other, to not assume that religion was morality and vice versa. That is what I'm going to leave us on. But my kind of, I suppose, conclusions, or I want to bring out of this, as I say, drawing very much, or building maybe on what came out of the AGM earlier and all of the discussions that have already been had, is that for these individuals and for so many other people, their involvement with the humanist movement wasn't just some footnote to their biographies, it was inextricably linked with their activism and also their personal philosophies. A sense of community and that sharing of values was central to this, and that was achieved as part of individual groups and their relationships with other people directly, as well as that sense of being part of something bigger. Also, as we've seen again from the AGM, but also through this, that collaboration with other groups and with international groups has always been a part of the movement, and it's amazing and perhaps natural that still continues so much in the work of Central London Humanists today. And in terms of why it's relevant, I'm really biased. I obviously think that the history is important and fascinating and all of those things, but I do think it's valuable to acknowledge that we are part of this tradition, that we're inheritors of something that lots of these people really did fight for, and also got a huge amount of. It's important to celebrate our successes and note where humanists have, as they have, been involved in ushering in major changes in society and in the wider world, and also to interrogate our failures where they've happened. I'm by no means saying that every person who didn't believe in God was a perfect, upstanding citizen who changed the world for the better. We've got some skeletons in our closet as well. But I think that's all part of not just the history of humanism, but also how we make sense of that history as humanists today. So, yeah, that's it from me. Do go on the website, and thanks.